Our next author kind of brings this all home, the 20th year celebration, because he was actually the first guy to take the stage that day. And yes, I'm talking about John Grisham. Back then, he was read from his new book, The Rainmaker at the time. And now 20 years later, John is still writing his wildly successful and incredibly popular novels and legal thrillers, many of which have been adapted into box office hits. And just this past year, his very first book, A Time to Kill, was made into a Broadway play. John's newest novel, Sycamore Row, takes readers back to the same Mississippi town and the world that he created in that first novel, A Time to Kill. One of the most successful authors of our time, a man who told me he wanted to grow up and be a baseball player, which sounds like any typical American child. He's been quoted as saying, "My success was not planned, but it could only happen in America." Please welcome back to Houston, the one and the only John Grisham.
Thank you, Pierce. That was awfully nice. Nice to be back in Houston. Obviously, Walter Isaacson and Christina Klein are far more diplomatic and nicer than most writers. They didn't say what was obvious, although Walter got kind of close. Writers are huge supporters of literacy. It's a proven fact that people who can read buy more books than people who can't read. So we love literacy. It's also an honor to be here 20 years later and thank all the folks who have made the past 20 years possible. Mrs. Bush and this foundation, all the wonderful work you've done. When they contacted me a few months ago about coming back, I said to my wife, I said, it'd be fun to go back. It's been 6 or 7 years since I was there. And I contacted the planner here, and I said, sure, it's been a few years. She said, Mr. Grisham, it's been 20 years since the first event. I thought, well, that's what you call aging, I guess. In 1991, the firm was published, and it got off to a pretty good start. One day, Barbara Bush was leaving the White House on the South Lawn and headed to the helicopter, and she was holding a copy of the hardback copy of The Firm. This is spring of 1991. And she was photographed with the green book, The Firm. And around my house, it's still known as the Green Book for more than one reason. And so a reporter asked her, somebody asked her what she was reading, and she said something nice, and it got picked up, and they saw it in New York and got excited and, whatever. And so I sent her an autographed copy of The Firm, and she sent me an enlarged copy of the photograph, autographed by her. And that photograph is still on the wall 23 years later, and it will never leave. It has a special place on my wall. Over the years, I've developed this list that I have, about 200 names of people who I sign autographed special notes to people about a month before the next book comes out. I'll send these preferred people, my mother, my mother-in-law, my people who mean something to me, close friends, old friends, whatever. And Mrs. Bush has been on the list for many years, but they get an autographed copy of the book before it comes out. And she always sends me a beautiful handwritten note thanking me for the book, and we've had this wonderful relationship. A few years later, I got a note from her husband who said he had just read the book, the latest book, whatever it was, and he explained how Barbara, it took a few months because Barbara hides the book, she hoards the book, she reads the book, and it took him a while to read the book. And I thought, well, what a cheapskate. Why can't you go buy your own copy, Come on, man, it's only $30, you can half price at Sam's Club, it doesn't cost a whole lot of money. I thought, well, it's not very dignified for the former president to be at Sam's Club rummaging around for bargains. So I said, okay. So I put him on the list, and he's been on the list. They each get their own autographed book every year, and without fail, they send me a wonderful personalized note thanking me, and this has been going on for a long time. 20 years ago, when we kicked this thing off, we had a great evening across the street here in downtown Houston. Larry McMurtry was on the program. I can't remember who else. After the party, after the readings, after all the stuff, dinner, whatever, my fondest memory was sitting around late at night with the President of the United States, former President, having a drink, talking. Not about politics, not about books and movies, not about religion, not about women. We talked about baseball. Baseball. He played in college. He loved the game. This is back in the days of Bagwell and Biggio. Fond memories. We talked about baseball for a long time, and so tonight I thought I would forget the fiction and read something I've written about baseball. I have a hard time reading stuff from the fiction. I've never gone back and read one of my books. By the time I write it and rewrite it and revise it and edit and copy edit, all with a deadline over and over and over again in a short period of time, by the time it's done, I'm really tired of it. I'm tired of it. I have never gone back and read one of my books. I don't want to do that. I can't make myself do that. And by the time the book comes out a few months later, I'm already thinking about, the next book. So I just don't want to go back and read from Sycamore Row. So I hope that doesn't disappoint you. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something a whole lot different. I'm going to read about my final at-bat as a baseball player. People ask me all the time, or students primarily, when you were young, did you dream of being a writer? And the answer is no. When I was a kid or a student, I never thought about being a writer. It came later in life. It just sort of happened one day, and I didn't see it coming. When I was a kid, I dreamed of being a baseball player. And I had just enough talent to keep me going for a while, a few years. I peaked when I was about 15, although I didn't realize it for a few years. But I was just sort of good enough to keep going for a while. And I love the game. Even today, I'll watch a pro baseball game, and I'll think to myself, why couldn't I do that? What happened? Why wasn't I good enough to play that game? Because I love the game. And so what I'm going to read you tonight is the introduction I wrote to a book called Boo. It's about a college baseball coach who's legendary in Mississippi. Boo Ferris pitched for the Red Sox in the 1940s. He won 25 games in 1946. He won 22 games the following year. He was destined for greatness. And one night, something snapped in his arm, and it was all over. And he went back to Mississippi and became a legendary college baseball coach at a small school. And when I grew up, a lot of kids, a lot of high school players wanted to play for Boo Ferris. They published his biography a few years ago. They asked me to write the introduction to Boo's biography, and I said, sure. Even though he cut me, okay, I was going to write the... And this is something I have written, and I hope you enjoy it. It's called, don't worry, it's very short. I'd love to tell stories about the Bushes all night long, but Neil has us on this death march. You can't get past in 10 minutes. So. It's called The Kindest Cut, also my last at bat. Boo Ferris ended my baseball career in the fall of 1974. I was a 19-year-old walk-on at Delta State University, and the fact that I was still playing baseball at that age was a sad commentary on the wisdom of all my previous coaches. Long before I turned 19, someone should have taken a bat and chased me away from the ballpark. Boo finally got rid of me, but in a much classier fashion. I had played my freshman year at a junior college. Actually, I set the bench. My talents unseen and underappreciated by the coaching staff. I was a bona fide prospect, at least in my mind, and after a miserable season, I decided to move on. I could not entrust my future to idiots with such limited vision. Coach Ferris had the reputation of welcoming walk-ons and giving them a fair chance. So I transferred to Delta State and hit the field. I knew immediately that I was out of place, but survived the first round or two of cuts and began to play with some confidence. It was all premature. The best player on the team was a freshman named Stuart Clyburn, a hot shot from Jackson, Mississippi. His twin brother Stan had signed with the Angels. Stuart had been drafted too, but couldn't come to terms. I still wish he had turned pro and skipped college. Clyburn was a right-handed pitcher, strong, powerfully built, looked great in his uniform, and carried himself with the swagger of an 18-year-old who'd been drafted. He threw a fastball that I had trouble seeing. It was very hard, and it moved and danced and cut here and there, and I wanted no part of it. I hung on until the inter-squad games began. Sure enough, one day we were stretching and limbering up in the outfield when word spread that Clyburn was pitching. I thought about pulling a muscle and sitting it out. I thought about quitting. My two roommates were having a wonderful time every afternoon chasing girls and such, and there I was trying to convince someone that I could still play baseball. I faced Clyburn in the top of the third inning. I was usually at the bottom of the lineup. And not surprisingly, the bases were empty. He had struck out the first 6 and showed no signs of being worried about the bottom 3. I walked to the plate, waited. The umpire said, "Batter up." Looked at me and I said, "I'm up." He said, "Son, you got to get in the batter's box." And I said, "Relax, don't worry. It's a new stance. I know what I'm doing. I'll just be cool." I inched forward slowly. I kicked some dirt, dug in, glared at the mound, cocked my bat as if I just might launch one into the cotton fields far beyond the scoreboard. Clyburn was watching, scowling. Like all good pitchers, he had a mean streak, and I guess I'd done something to offend him. Perhaps I was crowding the plate, though I could barely see it. I wanted Clyburn to have all the plate he could possibly need. Perhaps he didn't like my sneer, which may have appeared disrespectful, but wasn't really intended to be. His first pitch was inside, considerably so. But since I was so far away from the plate, it didn't matter. Oddly, it wasn't that hard. I turned on the pitch, smacked it, drilled a gorgeous line shot that curved foul deep down the left field line. I watched with great admiration, and perhaps I watched it a bit too long. I had pulled Clyburn. Surely Coach Ferris was impressed with this magnificent foul ball. My finest moment, though, would not last long. I dug in again, 1 or 2 inches closer to the plate, spat, wiggled my rear end just a little, and glared at the mound. Enough of this, Clyburn decided. He wound himself up, kicked high, and unleashed a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. The target was my helmet. For one terrifying split second, I was frozen. Then I managed to lurch back and spin around, and as the ball sailed just under my peach fuzz chin, I could actually feel the heat and the wind. I could have been killed. I picked up my bat, found my helmet, dusted myself off, and in doing all this, managed to mumble and snarl as if I just might charge the mound. In situations like this, tough guys take a step or two toward the pitcher and say something dramatic. I wanted to take a step or two toward the dugout and check my pants. For the third and final time, I dug in, glared with hatred at Clyburn while silently praying he would toss me a changeup on the outside part of the plate. He was glaring back. As it turned out, he had a real sense of humor. The next pitch was again aimed at my head, and I wasted no time getting out of the way. I lunged back in a desperate somersault, bat and helmet flying in various directions. And as I rolled in the dirt halfway to third base, I heard the umpire yell, "Strike." Then I heard laughter from both dugouts. I glanced up to see the catcher holding the ball, no doubt for my benefit, in a perfect spot, knee-high in the center of the strike zone. The beanball, as I later learned, had become a curveball that dropped and broke beautifully across the plate. The humiliation was overwhelming. I waved at the next pitch and almost sprinted back to the dugout. Most coaches would have ended my misery right there on the spot, but Coach Ferris was far too nice. Late that afternoon, he stopped by my apartment, where he was informed by my roommates that I was playing an intramural flag football game. He found the game. I was sitting on the bench, my usual spot. When I saw him standing by the fence all alone, I walked over, offered a weak hello, and managed some small talk. He asked if I had a few minutes to stop by his office the following morning. When I returned to my apartment, my roommates were already celebrating the fact that I was about to get cut. I joined the party. In his office the next day, he was kind and gentle as always. The conversation went something like this. He said, "John, you had trouble with that curveball yesterday." "Yes, sir. I thought it was going to hit me." "That's why they throw them like that." "I guess so." He said, "Well, you had trouble with fastballs last week." "Yes, sir, they're awfully fast." He said, "Well, if you can't hit a fastball and you can't hit a curve, what can you hit?" I said, "Coach, I can murder a changeup if I know it's coming." He said, "Look, I was a pitcher one time, and pitchers can be cruel when they spot weaknesses." I said, "I've never liked pitchers." He said, "Well, they show up at every game." I said, "I despise them." He said, "Look," he put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Look, your grades are not too impressive." I said, "Yes, sir, I'm sort of drifting right now." He said, "Take my advice. I suggest you forget about baseball and hit the books." I said, "I think you're right." He said, "Good luck. Thanks, Coach, for the chance." We shook hands and said goodbye, and I'm not sure who felt worse. I was touched by how much he cared and how much he disliked that part of his job. His compassion for such an undeserving player was remarkable. I had not had a hit in 2 years. In 1991, I received a letter from Coach Ferris, handwritten in a beautiful script. The letter explained that he had just read The Firm and enjoyed it and was very proud. With great humor, he speculated as to how much credit he should take for ending my baseball career, which, of course, led to my writing career. I wrote him back, and I allowed him to take as much credit as he could possibly want. Typically, though, he declined. Thank you very much.